This is a lecture on period 2, and this is about the colonies and the American colonies sort of after they've been settled and once they really start to grow and to prosper. And so we'll be looking at the sort of more 18th century, the 1700s more so. Now, just starting off, just some periodization ideas about the colonial time. We can really divide it into two parts, and you can see, there are the two parts here: the period of salutary neglect, and then sort of the time that we're going to be looking at today of them coming of age, so to speak. So with the first part, like they get settled in the early 1600s. Jamestown is 1607. The New England colonies really is after 1630 that they take off. Maryland is 1620. New York is captured in 1660s, but had been settled for quite some time. And up until the 1690s in England, they're really concerned with domestic matters there. They're having a lot of problems in England at this time, conflicts over religion. And so the colonies were really left alone, and this is known as salutary neglect. Salutary meaning beneficial. Beneficial neglect. They're being left alone and to do as they please without anybody really sort of controlling them in any way. And so sort of seen as beneficial. And then around 1690s and just before, the troubles in England finally come to an end. And the period after that, up until the American Revolution, is really a golden age for England. It's England and the Atlantic, and doing very well. And you see some of the things on the side there, the British Navy really cracking down on piracy in all forms, really, punishing pirates in very public, humiliating executions of pirates. And so merchants feel protected, and so there's a lot more incentive and security to trade. Mercantilism was enforced greater. I'll talk a little bit more about mercantilism. And you see a little bit more of the crown, meaning, the British Parliament and the monarchy exerting more control over their colonies, which have now sort of grown up, and so they can provide a revenue and a source of trade. And so they're taking a lot more interest in what's going over there on the other side of the Atlantic. So the American history is very much tied in with what's going on in Europe right up until about 1815, which is when the War of 1812 ended. That's really the first time that America really stops looking over to the other side of the Atlantic and starts looking westward at the continent. But so they're very much still involved with what's going over there. So what is going on in England in the 17th century? And is this going to work this time? Yeah, there we go. Wars and religious wars. The whole conflicts with the Protestant Revolution wasn't never really settled, and so you have the Church of England, which had broken away from the Catholic Church, and then you got others who are still supportive of the Catholic Church, and then you got the Puritans who like that they've broken away from the Catholic Church, but want them to go, more Protestant. Puritans very much followers of John Calvin and Calvinism, which is, strip the religion bare of all the ornaments and finery and ritual, and just get it right down to the message of the book and the gospel. And so it's during this time that the colonies were left alone while England, they were fighting a civil war, and they'd even become a republic without a king for a little while. And so the colonists, this is when these American ideas of self-reliance, independence, leave us alone. We don't want authority over us. Americans are very anti-authority, very strong distrust of powers, concentrated powers, and especially distant powers. They don't like somebody else far away dictating their lives. And so this kind of culture and thinking and attitude develops during this time. Now, in the 1680s, King James II took command, and he was very unpopular. He's Catholic, and he wants to exert that Catholicism over the country and over the colonies as well. And he looked at the colonies and saw them as a source of revenue. He can't collect taxes because that involves convening parliament, which he doesn't really want to do because then they'll put limits on him. So he's seeing, I need money, so let's get it from the colonies. And so he's very dictatorial with the colonies, exerting control over them. He took all the New English colonies, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and so on, Vermont, and put them together under a single government that he controlled through his appointed governor, and it was Governor Andros, who was just hated in the colonies, and he was there to do one thing, and that was to suck as much gold and wealth out of the colony as possible and transfer that to the English crown. And then, taking away things that the colonists would see as natural rights, their right to assembly, to have local control. There's no more local courts, so if you were punished or you had some kind of grievance, you had to go to the imperial courts, which could be far away. Taxes were higher, and the Puritan churches were sort of put under the control of the English religion. So very, very unpopular. Now, fortunately for the colonists, you look at his fortunate thing is the people of England didn't really much like him either. And when he had a son, everybody's like, oh man, he's going to continue his reign, and through his son, there's going to be no end to this awful King James. And so they invited a foreigner, William, who's Dutch from the Netherlands, but he was married to James's sister, Mary. And they invited them, why don't you come on over and maybe take control? And because he's so popular, James fled and lived out his days in France. So this is known as the Glorious Revolution, when King William and his English wife, Mary, when they took control. And their attitude was, we're not going to exert control. We're going to let, do what you want. And, they did enforce, the Anglican Church is supreme, but all other religious toleration. And then they said to the colonies, we'll listen to you, but you got to listen to us, okay? And so once William and Mary come into power, this leads to the success of the colonies in terms of commerce and that sort of second period of time. So they make a deal. It's not really written down, but everybody sort of understands that there's going to be a back and forth between the crown, the English mother country, and the colonists. So in the governments that sort of get set up, we have a governor who's appointed by the crown. So the king and parliament, they make a decision of it's going to be an Englishman, is often very well established, friends with the king, who will be sent over to be governor of New York or governor of Massachusetts, and similar to a president today, they're the executive, and they have one significant power, and that's veto over any legislation. They can say no to any legislation that the local assembly will come through. Now, the local assembly is made up of the colonists, and they're elected, male property holders, and they've got control of the money, which is their big power, including, of course, the governor's salary. So under this arrangement, the governor and the crown and the local assembly, the colonists, they must come to agreements, and they must work together. And so it's a little give and take by both sides. And further, the colonies and the crown, what they're going to get out of this new relationship. And this is, again, it's not written down or anything, but it's sort of tacitly understood. The colonies will be left a little bit more alone, okay? They can take care of themselves. The English are not going to dictate to them how they're supposed to live their life. Some tax got lowered, the sugar tax, which I'll get back to that in a moment, just how important sugar was. Governors that were more flexible and willing to work with them, and more access to the slave trade, which is very lucrative. You can make a lot of money on the slave trade. And it was sort of understood that the colonists are English and Englishmen, wherever you're from. You're German or Scots, Irish or whatever, you're going to have the rights that an Englishman has, rights of free speech, assembly, these Enlightenment ideas that all Englishmen have. And fewer soldiers stationed in the colonies. Soldiers are expensive, and they don't really like these British soldiers lying around the redcoats. Now, the crown, what do they get? Well, they're going to get cooperation from the colonies. They'll pay the taxes that are asked of them. They'll follow the laws, and so there'll be cooperation. And you can get now a coordinated empire, and where in particular with trade, where trade is managed within the empire, and as much as possible to keep it within the empire. And that's what we call mercantilism. Mercantilism is the economic idea that all trade within the empire should remain in the empire. That there should not be trade with the French and the Spanish, but keep it within the colonies and the mother country. And the purpose of the empire is to enrich the mother country. So to this end, there were navigation laws that said, if you're selling wheat you grow in, say, New York, and you're selling it to Europe, you can't sell it directly to Spain or France. You must sell it to the English, who will then sell it over to the Europeans. And so you can only trade within English ports. And to that end, the ships can only be English ships. Now that can mean ships built in English colonies, which many of them were up in Massachusetts, lots of shipbuilding, but it has to be done on English ships. Now, there is smuggling, there is breaking of these laws. For example, New York rum makers, they have to buy sugar from British West Indies, but maybe, sugar from the French West Indies, maybe they can get that a little cheaper. Okay, well, you're going to have to break the law to buy that sugar, which was done on occasion. But for the most part, the laws were followed, and the British are enforcing it a little bit more. And finally, there's just not going to be any sort of open rebellions amongst the colonists. They're going to obey. And from all of this, everybody benefits from this arrangement that went on. Which brings us to that Atlantic world and the trade that was going on. And, this is sort of triangular, but in fact, think of it like two different triangles. One which is between the colonies and England and Africa with the slaves. But then there's sort of another triangle here, which is the 13 colonies with the West Indies and of course the African slaves that were going on there. And just a couple of things to point out in these. One, the 13 colonies are very much connected to the West Indies. Now, what are they growing in the West Indies is sugar. And the sugar would then travel as molasses. See that word, molasses? Molasses is sort of like liquid, syrupy sugar, which would go to the colonies where they would distill it into rum. Rum, a very sweet alcoholic beverage, would then often be shipped over to Africa, and some trade goes on, and you've got some cash, and then you use that cash to buy some slaves, which then come over to grow the sugar. And many of those slaves, well, about 20% dying just on the voyage over. But then once they're in the West Indies, it's very labor intensive. They're worked almost to death. And so you're constantly having to replenish your labor supply of those slaves. So most slaves going to the West Indies, not necessarily up into the colonies, though there are some that are going on up there. And another thing is that the colonies are generally producing raw goods, which are then shipped over, either to Africa, the West Indies, they're selling them a lot of food, or to Africa. And then what's coming back is manufactured products. And so the balance of trade is definitely going to England. More species, by species, gold, coming into Britain. And there's generally a lack of hard currency in the colonies. They're always sort of short a supply of that as the balance of trade. The wealth generally is being sucked out of the colonies and into Britain, which is the whole point of mercantilism, and of course to benefit them. And so, and we get regional economies developing within the 13 colonies. And so if we look at them, up in New England, what we've got going on there is a very diverse economy, much more diverse. And there's manufacturing of shipbuilding, there's logging going on, there's ironworks going on, and then agriculturally they're growing a lot. And if you're down, economy suppressed, there's always fishing, whaling, these kinds of industries as well. So much more diverse. Middle colonies, the big thing is food products and wheat in particular, and selling a lot of that out to, for example, to the West Indies, and a little bit more diversity than in the South, but very much concentrated on agriculture. Now, the South, the least diverse. It's the big ones, of course, is tobacco. Continues to be a cash cow for the southern colonies. Rice is a big one, much of that rice being sold to the West Indies as well. And so reliance on these plantation cash crop kind of economy. And we can see that the diversity of the colonies, they really grow in population and in diversity during this time. It was a good place to move to if you're, a peasant in Europe. You have this opportunity if you can get across there to this, this new land, this America over there, that you have the opportunity to succeed in life as your own man, as your own boss, not as some peasant that much of the Europeans were at the time. And we can see the population really taking off during this time. So remember, sort of describing, the 1600s up to the 1650s as settlement. You can see the population is quite low. It's in the tens of thousands. And by 1690, which is the Glorious Revolution, it's only a couple of 100,000. But then you can see it going up in 10 years, 40,000, then 80,000, and then adding in over 100,000. And then then it starts to sort of snowball and really start to grow and to move up. Just to give you a little bit of context, France at this time, they had about 20 million people at this time. 1660. In 1660, France had 20 million people. England, only 5 million people in 1660. And the Dutch, just 2 million people. So really smaller compared, of course, to Europe, but starting to really boom after 1690. And brings us to finally last point. Are the Americans, what are they? Are the English or they are Americans? And they're a little bit of both, right? So English, you've got that culture. They're part of the English mercantilist economic system with trade and commerce, and a government system and liberties, as part of an English style of government and part of the English Empire. But they're becoming very unique as well, and they're bringing in different people that would blend into a new people, the Americans. The frontier is something that the Europeans just don't have. This area that's where there's really no government, where you're on your own, and there's dangers of natural environment, animals, bears and such, and of course the natives, and so you have to rely on yourself and take care of yourself. And Americans really growing this distrust of power at this time. But what would they call themselves? Well, they don't call themselves either of these. They don't call themselves, they don't say, I'm an Englishman, I'm an American. They might think of themselves as an Englishman, but more they would identify with their colony. So they might call themselves, I'm a Virginian, or I'm a Massachusetts man, or I'm a New Yorker, and but not I'm an American. That identity does not yet exist, and would start to come out during the Revolution, but it's even much longer after that this idea of this unique people, Americans, whether you're in the South or in the North. So in terms of identity, they're still thinking about their colony, and they might add on to that maybe Englishmen, if they are Englishmen, of course. Many are Germans, or the African slaves have, of course, their own identity as well. All right, that's it. Thank you very much for listening.